Dr. Riyeff, what is the rule of Saint Benedict?
So, short answer is it is a Latin text from the early to mid 6th century that tries to stipulate what a monastery community ought to do. Okay. But okay, longer answer. So, the Saint Benedict, we don't have much information on him at all, which isn't terribly, abnormal for someone from the 6th century, but some of his contemporaries are actually fairly well filled in for us, from different sources. But Benedict, it's pretty much this one document that Gregory the Great, the Pope, wrote in like the 590s or so, called the Dialogues. And there's four books of the Dialogues. Book two is all about Saint Benedict. So that's basically how we know that this guy even really existed, except for the fact that some manuscripts of the rules say, regula sancti benedicti, right? That's it. So if we didn't have Gregory's rule, that'd be about all that we know about the guy. Um, but anyway, but we do have that, and so it's a Latin saint's life from the early medieval period. So is it trying to be history or biography the way that we think about it? Not so much. But but is there real biographical information in it? One supposes. I mean, only like the strictest of cynic might say, or skeptic at least might say, like, no, this is all just, if we have no corroboration, then this is nothing. Um, but there's nothing to refute that any of this is basically what his life was like too. So anyway, so this guy, Benedict, grew up in Nursia, is the Latin form Norcia in Italy today. So like not terribly far from Rome. And he was part of a noble family. He went to Rome to study, is what Gregory tells us, and was basically disgusted by what he saw there, and was like, I can't deal with this. And so he flees the world, and hears that monastic call, which so monasticism in Christianity has been going on for a couple centuries by this time. The very late 400s, early 500s is when Benedict would have done this. Um, and so it's not as if there's no precedent, right? But he basically says, all right, I'm just going to go, wander off and live in a cave for 3 years at Subiaco. Uh, and, but has that like that fire in him to live that kind of life. Some, different things happen, whatever. Eventually, a community asks, will you be our abbot? Will you kind of be the head of our community of monks? And he says, this isn't going to go well because you guys don't really want me as your abbot. And they say, oh, of course we do. And he says, fine, okay. And then they try to poison him and all this, okay, whatever. So doesn't go well. But when he is finally ready to go lead an actual community of monks, and he founds 12 monasteries, so the story goes, Monte Cassino being the most exalted one, um, he knows that he has to set out some ground rules, right? Like, how do you actually do this, especially with the community? If you're living by yourself in a cave, you're accountable to yourself and God, I guess, right? But like, once you've gotten 40 guys together, how's this go? Um, and so he wrote this rule to say, here's how it goes. So there is, people think of it as a spiritual classic, in the Western spiritual tradition. It is that, in my opinion. It also is a strange text, if that's what we're going to call it, because some of it's just like, what does the cellarer do, right? Like they've got to like get food for the community. I mean that's not what you tend to think of being in a spiritual classic, but it's there because that's something that has to happen in a monastery. Somebody has to prepare the food and have it all stored up and all that. Um, but there are moments, of course, where he's talking about humility, right? So there's a chapter on just humility. Here's the different steps of humility and what it's like to grow in that virtue. Here's a chapter on obedience. Here's what it means to be a monk or nun, um, and to be practicing obedience in a lifelong kind of way. When he talks about someone like the abbot, there's a little more spiritual kind of guidance there too. Here's what it means to be a father of a community or a mother of a community. Um, so yeah, so there's certain chapters that for sure give us a sense of how are we cultivating a spiritual life in this community. But some of it's also just extremely practical. If you have to go run errands outside the monastery, what are you supposed to do? You know? Um, but then a big chunk of it also in the middle is concerned with the liturgy, the Opus Dei, the work of God. And so it's just a long series of things of like, okay, at the evening office, and I can do the whole like what's an office and all that if we want to.
For sure.
If the evening office, like, what psalms do you sing? How do you end it? And it just goes on and on about those things. So for a lot of people, that's the least interesting part of the rule. For some of us liturgy geeks, it's pretty fun to read. So, but those are the three basic things that are in the rule.
Mhm. Do we have a good idea of what monastic life was like before Benedict's rule?
Yeah, I mean there are attestations from the desert, the Egyptian desert, from Palestinian monasteries, and even from there's some sources for like European monasteries before this, not a ton. Although the rule of the master, the regula magistri, people found, I forget exactly when this was discovered, but fairly recently in terms of this kind of stuff, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, whatever it was. Then there's this rule called the Rule of the Master that was written in Latin, and it was not too long before Benedict was doing his stuff. And Benedict actually took a lot of his stuff, at least like the core of it, from the Rule of the Master, right? So he wasn't kind of inventing this whole cloth. He was like, okay, I've got this, I've got that, and some other sources, and he's compiling. But he does certainly he pairs a lot back. He takes a lot of the stuff from the Rule of the Master out, especially the harshest stuff. Um, but also kind of adds his own stuff in, and there's stuff in there in his rule, the Benedictine rule, that is not in the rule of the master at all. But anyway, the rule of the master and things like it gives a little sense of what even European monasticism was like in the period. But then also, even in the desert in Egypt, St. Pachomius has a rule that goes, I'm not a late antique scholar. I think that's for early fourth century, but don't quote me on that one. I have to look that up.
Okay.
But yes, I mean, but there are, texts that actually describe what these communities were like back then, for sure.
The rule of St. Benedict is structured in a series of sort of bullets or like paragraphs where it gives specific guidance to different topics and stuff. Could you speak a bit to that structure? What kinds of things does it cover? What sort of areas of life?
Yeah, I happen to have one right here. Um, so the prologue, it starts out kind of saying, hey, if you're feeling like you need, this is not the way that Benedict puts it, but more of a challenge, right? If the kind of life you're living is just not what you see as valuable, and you need to like really dedicate yourself to a cause. Um, the cause of Christ, right? Then the monastery is the place for you. And here's what that school of the Lord's service he calls it looks like. And here's why we need it and this kind of thing, right? What is the value of monastic life for the spiritual life? He starts there. Okay. So that's the prologue tries to do. And then he does a little bit of setup work, like what are the kinds of monks? There are hermits, there are Cerebites, which that's not the kind you want to be. There's Gyrovags. Those are really the ones you don't want to be. And then there's Cenobites, and that is what Benedict is trying to make a rule for. People who live in a community and share everything in common. Those are Cenobitic monks. Um, so he's kind of setting that out. Talks about what does the abbot do in a monastery? What's the abbot supposed to be like? So he's trying to like give a sense of the hierarchical structure there. He talks about the prior, all that. He has chapter 4 is kind of an interesting catch-all kind of chapter. It's the tools of good works, and it's just like a list of here's all the things that the Gospels and the letters of St. Paul and different epistles say we ought to do. So it's like a moral exhortation, but it really isn't trying to give like a full sense of things. It's really just like here's a thing, here's a thing, here's a thing, here's a thing. And the most famous of which is that you should keep death before you every day of your life. So that's a nice one. Um, but then he goes into foundational kinds of virtues for the monastic life, like obedience, like humility, like restraint of speech, why we should respect silence, these kinds of things. And then he does go into this kind of I forget how many. It's at least 10 or so chapters of here's how we do the offices,
Mhm.
the as a communal prayers that we do throughout the day. Then he talks even about, why do we care about Psalms? Why are we singing Psalms all day? So there's a little bit about the reason that we use the Psalms. Um,
What is
there,
the reason that we use the Psalms?
yeah, yeah. Well, he doesn't really give like a good answer to a modern mindset. But he said psalmody is basically um, drawing on the sense of the liturgy as like the church praying as Christ praying to the Father, but also then
Mhm.
like us as humans praying to Christ as intercessor. The Psalms are just this treasure trove of ways of doing that, right? And so the Psalms must be sung, right? That's just the way it has to be.
Mhm.
Um, and to uh, sing the Psalms disrespectfully is like an egregious kind of fault, right? He says that our minds and our tongues should be in unison when we sing, right? That kind of thing. Um,
Right.
then does go into the problems that arise and the kind of penalties that might accrue when one makes errors. So that can be just like small faults, like when you're singing in choir, if you make if you mispronounce something or you forget a phrase or whatever, there's something to be done to make up for that reparation, right? And for example, one of those things being the next office, you have to come and lay prone on the floor while everybody else walks into choir before you get to go to your seat, right? So it's not like, corporal punishment or anything, but you know, humiliating probably, right? And that's the point. So, not something that probably comes natural to us as a way of being in a community, but they were about it. Um, and then there's like excommunication, right? If somebody, I mean, there's actually, I will say, while excommunication, like you just get kicked out, sounds a little harsh, of course. He does talk about how like there's increments, right? Like somebody comes and talks to you, and the abbot admonishes you, and then like when you're kind of on probationary excommunication, there's I forget, is it senectus? I forget. There's this certain word for an elder. The elder's supposed to like come in secret, to like, hey, I know things aren't good right now. What's going on? They're supposed to, but like, the abbot didn't send me. I'm here to like try to
Uh-huh.
get on my own or whatever. So there's these steps before someone just okay, you gotta go, right? But excommunication is certainly a feature of this life where you're just gone. Then there's stuff about, who gets to eat at the abbot's table, how does the abbot receive guests when they come to the monastery. And Benedict, even in that day, says, as much as we're trying to leave the world, the monastery is never without gifts. Sorry, without guests. So like, there's just always people coming to see what this life is like and to know what's going on there. Um, and on and on and on. How do you take care of the sick? Right? Like what happens when people get sick? People are going to get sick even if you live in the monastic life. Um, People are also going to get old, right? What do you do with the elderly in this kind of situation? People used to give their children to monasteries. What do you do when somebody drops an 8-year-old off at the door and now they're just yours? Like that was reality for them. So, uh,
Right.
so all kinds of stuff, all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, that child dropping off process, I know at least in England was very big, and Bede, the Venerable Bede, was an oblate, as we call them himself, and mentions that a couple times.
Yeah.
You have alluded now to the office. I, I know that the office is a big deal, and we should also probably mention this phrase that I hear discussed a lot, ora et labora. Do they have a lot to do with each other? Is that should we talk about these things in one breath?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, the Ora Labora thing, I think I can I mean, not dismiss readily, but I can talk about real quick. The Ora Labora is kind of the unofficial slogan of the Benedictines and has been for several centuries, but that's not in the rule.
Okay.
It's a kind of I, there is somebody did figure out like where does this first show up? It's something I'm pretty sure it's early modern. Um,
Mm,
but it's somebody's kind of enterprising way of like describing, summarizing in a very quippy kind of way. What is this life like? Ora et labora, prayer and labor, work, working with our hands and doing manual labor. Um, so yeah, so it's readily taken up now, and I mean, plenty of if you go to Benedictine monasteries or websites or whatever, you're going to see this phrase all over the place. But it's not actually in the rule. So I mean, I'm usually thinking about the medieval stuff and the antique stuff.
right.
So um, Not, I usually don't think about that. But then people bring it up and I'm like, oh yeah, right. Yeah, we talk about that all the time in Benedictine circles. So, um, but yeah, but the aura part of that, of course, is different things, but foundationally and kind of, you can't have this kind of monasticism without it. It is the divine office, the liturgy of the hours, is usually what it's called now. But also Benedict himself calls it the Opus Dei, the work of God. And that's part of the Ora et Labora thing is that the prayer is actually called a kind of work, right? In his rule. So the divine office, the offices go back. I mean, the monastics will tell you it goes back to the Gospels, right? Like the apostles going to the temple at the ninth hour, etc. Like that is them doing the offices. Um, Historians are going to say, well, sure, we can kind of make links between these things, but no, they're not thinking about it the same way as a fourth century monk is. Okay. Um, but the idea is that there are times for prayer, right? And they're not clock time, they're cosmological time. And so in the middle of the night, you're supposed to get up and get back to your question, actually, Graham, about, why the Psalms? Well, I mean, the Psalms themselves tell us. David says, in the night I rise and sing to you. And so, okay, that's what we got to do, right? So we'll have nocturnes, this office where we get up at 2 in the morning or whatever it is, and we'll sing. And that's actually that's the longest one. So it's it's pretty tough. Most communities now that are still doing this way of life don't actually get up in the very middle of the night.
Oh,
Often,
really?
yeah,
Oh,
yeah, I know. There are
tell
some
the
very
bishop.
rigorous, yeah, there's some very rigorous communities that do, but most people have, okay, we'll get up at like 5 and do it, or 4:30 and do it, and yeah,
Interesting.
um, yeah. But then there's so then Benedict describes all of these things, the kind of horarium, the way through the day, the hours. Uh, but usually, there's other things to be done, or you can go back to sleep for a little bit or whatever. And then we're gonna, before the sun rises, there's another hour of prayer that one must do, right? That's another office, the office of prime, which actually is suppressed now too after Vatican II. And then Lauds, and then the third hour, so 9 a.m. or so, the sixth hour, noon, the ninth hour, 3 p.m. Then Vespers, which comes from ad vesperat in Latin to when evening is drawing on, the evening office, and then one more right before turning in for the night, usually pretty early because you have to get up at 2 in these older communities. So there's this round throughout the day that is not supposed to be kind of an arbitrary set of guidelines. It's actually like we need to sanctify the entire day. God has
Mhm.
given us this day, and so we have to continually remind ourselves throughout that day, in sync with the sun, right? That this is what we're called to do. This is what we're called to be about, is praising God, not whatever else we have to do. And there's actually, it's very cool in the rule it talks about when whatever you're doing in the monastery, when you hear the bell for the office, you go. You just put down
Mhm.
whatever you have in hand and you go do it. Right. And there's actually fun stories about different, actually, like right behind me, Bede Griffiths is a Benedictine monk from England who spent a lot of his life in India. And and so, he was doing interreligious dialogue, and he was living in an ashram, a Catholic Benedictine ashram in southern India, in the throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s. But people who would go visit with him, from the West, and would be like, he does it every day, right? Anytime that bell rings for the offices, he's been living this very different life for a long time. But whenever the bell rings, he puts down whatever he's doing and he just goes to the chapel because it's what you have to do if you're a monk, right? So and that's kind of the cool story of monasticism to me, as somebody who just like studies this stuff, but also participates in it too. Um, is that like across cultures, across languages, across timescales, across political organizations, across whatever, there's these kinds of continuities, and like it's not the exact same life in all these different times and places and cultures, but there's certain touchstones that like, no, yeah, that's what we do, you know, and that's a really cool thing to see, and a lot of it does revolve around the offices and the monastic Benedictine world.
Yeah, I'm not obviously a fourth or fifth or sixth century Latin expert, honestly. Just like I think, honestly, like most early medieval scholars, my expertise jumps from classical Latin to like early
Yeah.
medieval England. So there's a big
Yeah.
gap there. But if it means the same that it meant in classical Latin, officia, the offices, that's
Mhm.
like things that you have to do. An
Yeah.
officium in
Right.
classical Latin, it would be something that is like that you have to do, something agendum, maybe it would be a good
Yeah.
synonym, like something that
Right.
that it's like a job, almost a task. So it's an interesting way to, as English speakers, when we hear offices, I don't really think of anything except honestly like a work office,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
which is perhaps not a horrible association, but tasks might be another way to translate it. Um, I don't know if you have thoughts
Yeah.
on that.
Yeah, no, like obligatory service, I think is
Mhm.
how I actually think of office in my head whenever I say it. And that, and that's why, yeah, we have offices that we go to and there's offices downtown at the town hall or whatever. Because those are things that are obligatory service and need to get done by somebody. So yeah, there is
Mhm.
that overlap still. But yeah, you're right that like the word doesn't tend to mean that to us when we first hear it a lot of the time. Maybe like it's under there, if you really go at it. But yeah, when they talk of in this way, servitia in Latin is a way that they talk about it in this time period too. And Ethelwald himself, who we'll get to, calls it theodome, right? Servitude.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, one question that I want to touch on a couple times during this conversation is how can someone nowadays use this text?
Yeah.
For sure, even the Latin edition has several translations available online.
Yeah.
We're going to be talking about your book, which is a translation of the Old English edition of the Rule of Saint Benedict. Of course, Athelwold's expansions included. But do you have any sort of advice for how the average layperson who's just interested in this kind of thing can apply this to their life?
Yeah, absolutely. So one, I have to put a plug in for presence. And that means like, find a monastery and go, whether one is religious or not, whether one is a Christian or not, whether one is a Catholic or not, And there are monastic branches outside of Catholicism and Orthodoxy too. Um, but of course, it's a bigger part of the world in those traditions. But they're very welcoming folks, and hospitality is kind of their game. So, it's very rare do I ever hear people say, "Oh, I went to this monastery and it was a horrible experience." Very often it's like, "Oh, it was so amazing." Even if they're not in any way involved in that dogmatic world. So anyway, yeah, I'll just say, these people are embodying. It's really about, embodying this as a whole way of life. And so to
Mhm.
to go interact with people who have been doing that for in some cases decades, like that's the best thing we can do in that way. But anyway, if one is just reading this though, which I do regularly, it's I mean the actually you brought up oblates earlier, right? So there was in the beginning of this, way back in Benedict's time, oblates were, and for several centuries, until about the 11th century, were children given to the monasteries, right? That was just like a thing to do. It wasn't a weird thing to do, it was just a thing to do. But fairly soon after that, and then really picking up in like the 19th, 20th century, people who affiliate themselves with monasteries are called oblates, right? And so this is a way of kind of like formalizing a kind of taking on of Benedictine spirituality when you're not going to go be a monk or a nun, right? That too, not necessarily just like the monks themselves, the nuns themselves, but also there's oblate communities all over, and also again people who are just trying to make this a real part of their life and integrate it. So there's other people to learn from too that aren't in professed life. But also just as someone reading it on their own, there's all kinds of good stuff in here. I mean, and even if one isn't going to perform the offices, that they're talking about, right? One can think of other kinds of offices that one might do, right? Even if it's certain kinds of meditation or something, right? That like sticking to it and doing it every day, right? When Benedict's talking about the offices, we can think of other mindfulness practices as, kind of filling in there. But the way that he talks about doing it can help us, it can help guide us, taking that seriously and taking it very rigorously and making the discipline something that shapes our whole life. Like he's talking about with the offices. Um, there's all kinds of good stuff in the prologue and the epilogue, the kind of the last chapter, for kind of inspiring spiritual kinds of things. But more specifically, I do think when he talks about obedience, there's some ways in which the way that a nun is going to listen to her abbess and perform obedience, right, that she vows. And that's going to look different from like I'm married and the way that I'm supposed to be obedient to my wife, it's not going to look exactly like that. But are there, like structural features of that Benedict talks about that are transferable? Of course there are, right? And there's actually like a real beauty to thinking about these like our modern ways of doing things in relief, when we engage with this really ancient way of thinking about this stuff. Because like, yeah, I probably don't think about obedience in the way that Benedict does, but when I read of him talking about obedience, it kind of like reignites my own sense of what is obedience, right? And I start to compare and contrast what he's saying with my own experience, and maybe I start seeing that, oh, like maybe he does have something to say to me. Maybe thinking about this way, not that I'm gonna like, I mean, he says like whatever your superior tells you to do, you do it. Okay,
Hmm.
maybe I'm not like on board with that, but um, especially not in the vowed life. But there's other ways he talks about obedience that can be really fruitful or something. When he talks about the restraint of speech, I think that to me, this was one of the most compelling aspects of the rule to me when he talks about silence and the place that silence should have in our lives. It's fantastic stuff for moderns to read, right? If nothing else, just to realize, oh, people actually think this and have
Hmm.
thought this, right? That like silence, and and in Benedict's day, he doesn't have a smartphone. He's not on Zoom doing an interview. There's chatter, there's stuff, right? They were humans. There was all kinds of stuff going on. And if we think of Rome as not being like a really noisy, busy place, I mean, of course it was, right? So in some ways, again, like massive differences, but also very similar, like we're just all humans trying to live a life, right? So the way that he talks about restraint of speech and respect for silence, I think is especially really valuable for us. And again, that's not to say like we'll stop talking or we're gonna give up a smartphone or whatever, but maybe we realize anew like there can be a really good, fruitful outcome to having a little more discipline in those areas. Maybe I don't need to say so many things. Maybe I don't need to post so many things. Maybe I can just like take a step back and be more grounded and more centered. That might not be the worst thing for all of us, actually, right now, in my opinion. But like he's insistent on that. He actually says very clearly the respect for silence means that we should not even say some good things. So how much more so never say any of the bad things, right? Like it's just right out. You don't use bad words. You don't say bad things about people. You don't grumble, right? Because you don't even say good words sometimes out of respect for silence, And like that's something that's really stuck with me. I'm not terribly great at following it, but it's something to aspire to, right? And
Hmm.
today. But yeah, but so there's different kinds of things like that throughout the rule that there's like the little pearls. Whereas, for a while it's like, okay, I don't know if like talking about the ways that they serve wine in the sixth century is really terribly relevant to my life. But then they say something else and you're like, oh, wait, there it is. Like that sentence actually is really, that's powerful and it can be relevant and all that. Oh, one other example quick, like to make it concrete. Um, when he talks about the artisans of the monastery, pretty late in the rule. There's a whole chapter, and again, yeah, like as you said, Graham, the chapters really like paragraphs, couple
Hmm.
paragraphs. These are not we think of as chapters, but that's what they're called. So the chapter on artisans, again, you're gonna have people in the monastery who are doing stuff, right? Because they're trying to be very self-contained kind of communities, right? Like we don't need to rely on others to be doing stuff because we're trying to live a life apart. It never works that way, but they try, of course. But so you need to have artisans in the monastery, people who can do woodwork, people who can do pottery, people who can do all these kinds of things. And he says, when people make things in the monastery, you should sell them for less than people in the world do. And then the line I think I'm remembering right is "Ut in omnibus glorificator Deum," that
Oh.
in all things God may be glorified, right?
Mhm.
So like even the buying and selling stuff, like no, don't take as much as other people as people will give you, basically, right? Like lower premium, right? Like sell it closer to cost because that's gonna give glory to God. To be like, no, we don't
Mhm.
need as much, right? Like don't give it to us. So there's like a restraint even on, this is obviously not anywhere near capitalism yet, but there's a restraint on that, profit motive, right? Like don't do that.
Right.
You don't need it. So like there's, so that, that in all things God may be glorified is another one of those kind of mottos that the Benedictines use. Like this is what we're about. But it actually comes from this thing about like artisans making pots and then going to sell them for cheaper in the market because they shouldn't have the full price. Stuff
Mhm.
like
Probably not good for the local pot making community, though.
there is that paradox, right? I've thought about that so many times. You're underselling people? That's not charitable.
Anyway, so then we get to early medieval England. We obviously have very strong monastic communities in the time of Bede, Saint Hild, figures like that appear. But by the time we get to Saint Athelwold, uh, there clearly is need for a reform because it happens. Could you talk a bit to what is going on before Athelwold really comes into power?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So the it's fun that you bring up Bede and Hild because this is what the reformers do, right? They kind of return us to their historiography is in seventh and eighth century England, we had this great thing going,
Hmm.
and because they did, right? They had Aldhelm, that all that too, and so they knew that there were these riches, right? Especially because a lot of that stuff had made it to the continent with the different Anglo-Saxon missionaries to the continent, and so it had been preserved even in places where it wasn't preserved in England, but like they still were aware, like these were our guys. Um, but then in 793, the sacking of Lindisfarne by the Vikings, and those kinds of depredations ensue for about a century, right? Not, unremitting, but like civilization is getting harder to do in the face of the Vikings.
Yeah.
Um, and so the making of books and the singing of chant to praise God like becomes a harder going concern, right? So a lot of the monasteries are, if they're not broken up, they're at least kind of drifting into secular lords who did own them even during Bede's day, right? Like that's not a corruption thing in their minds, right? Like secular lords, like, well, who else is going to give us land to have a monastery, right? Like they got to do that stuff, right? So that's an interesting kind of side thing. Um, but when they have too much influence on the community, and basically now they're just like the guy's servants, and they're all just like living the secular life. But like, well, we have this monastic church, so we call ourselves monks, but we're really just like landowners, and
Interesting.
this is problematic, right? So it's not that all the monasteries just suddenly disappear, but they've kind of like, after decades and decades of this, it's just harder to keep the kind of light shining of what monasticism is supposed to be or whatever, right? Um, but some of them do close up and some of them just go away and all that because like what we need is to survive. What we need is to fight the Vikings off. What we need is to, these things. Um, but is it just that simple? I mean, surely not. There's other stuff going on, but that's a massive part of it. So then when Alfred in the later ninth century, King Alfred is able to subdue the Vikings, but that really just means like giving them half the country, right?
Yeah, subdue. He's able to survive.
It's always fun how people describe that the Guthrum thing. But anyway, um, but when he's able to establish stability, right? Like that's the
Mhm.
new right. However he's able to do it, he establishes stability again. Um, if we know anything about Anglo-Saxon England and those projects that Alfred was spearheading, one of the key features here was we don't have a lot of Latin anymore. We need to start translating texts into English because we just don't have the infrastructure education-wise to get everybody up to speed on Latin the way that we need to have like a really functioning kingdom in this day and age, right? This modern age of the ninth century. And so they started translating texts, classic texts by Gregory the Great, by Boethius, these Bede himself, the ecclesiastical history, all these things. So there's a like a seed laid there, right? That one way we can get this thing going again, one way we can get scholarship going, but also just like a stronger sense of community, and a stronger sense of polity, right? Going again is by translating, and by using the English language instead of needing to train a whole bunch of people in Latin. So not that they don't want to do that too, they want to, but they realize they just don't have the manpower and the hours to to spare. Okay, but yeah, so things started going a little better, and under Athelstan, so Alfred's grandson, if I'm doing that right, I better be. Um, but in the 920s and 930s, in the 10th century, he's bringing in scholars from other places. He's importing books again, especially like from Brittany, if I remember right. But that stuff I haven't looked at for a long time, so I shouldn't go any further there. But he's trying to do this too, right? Like build things back up, get some learning going again. Um, but it's hard to get it stable, outside of the royal vicinities. So when Ethelwald comes onto the scene, he's born, oh, I forget. Let me look at the 904 to 909, somewhere in there, right? When Ethelwald comes onto the scene, St. Dunstan is already at Glastonbury, this Wessex monastery that is kind of like gaining steam again, right? And like things are going well in that monastery, and they start to see like this could be a model for like doing new things in the kingdom again and really getting this spread, right? And why would we want to do that? I mean, I do think that they had genuine desire for God's service, and like they really felt that. I'm not a cynic about that, but I'm also not naive. And of course, they needed the social and political stability too, right? And we have to remember that in this period, monasteries and bishoprics, right, they are part of the social fabric in ways that we like have a hard time imagining anymore, right? I was just telling my students earlier today, like, remember, as we leave class, bishops were lords, right? Like, it's not that they like had influence on the state. They were part of the state apparatus, right? Like a bunch of people are giving their taxes to the bishop, to the abbot, to the abbess. It's those people who have to marshal armies in certain areas and all this stuff, right? So they realize that as they're able to kind of get these communities going again, it can build infrastructure of different sorts, right? And it's all to the good, as far as the powerful go, anyway. Um, so that's starting to happen. Ethelwald is a prime mover in that. Dunstan is a prime mover in that. Dunstan had spent some time on the continent at St. Peter's in Ghent, which is a reformed monastery coming from the reform in Gorze,
Mhm.
which is near Metz. So he was getting like, oh, there's stuff going on the continent that's pretty cool, right? And like they're really doing some new stuff here and kind of like revitalizing monastic life. I should bring that back, right? And that's when he goes to Glastonbury, starts doing that. Um, and Oswald, Saint Oswald, similarly from I forget where he's from, but he ends up Bishop of Worcester. He goes to Fleury, right, which is in the Cluniac orbit. So
Right.
another 10th century monastic reform. So he's also like, oh man, they're doing some pretty cool stuff. So like these guys who are going to the continent coming back are like, we need to be doing this, right? This is where it's at now. Um, so Ethelwald, unfortunately, has his dreams dashed. He wants to go to the continent as a young man in Athelstan's court, but the Queen Mother is like, no way. This guy is too
Mhm.
valuable. He's got to stay. Um, and that's just fascinating to me. It's like a fun part of the
Right.
story.
Because he was the tutor of was it Edward or
Edgar.
no Edgar? Edgar, yes.
Yep.
So I guess just too important at court,
Yeah.
so he wasn't allowed to leave. That's
Yeah. It's
fascinating.
or like maybe it's not that he was like too more important than Dunstan necessarily, but because you're right, this is how I usually put it. But maybe they just realized like his strengths are these kinds of strengths that we need domestically. And Dunstan's a guy like, yeah, he can go, and Oswald can go, and they'll come back at some point probably, right? Or
Mhm.
call it back, they will. But like their particular strengths may be better used in those areas, right? But Ethelwald, no, like this guy's got to stay. He's a
Yeah.
he's a domestic guy. But yeah, that's right. So he becomes so kind of in like a presumably trying to like assuage that or like comfort that situation or console that situation, kind of ameliorate it. They give him the monastery of Abingdon to get going. So they give him monks from other places, including Glastonbury, after he's been trained at Glastonbury for a while by St. Dunstan. And so, but and he does well with it, right? Abingdon's in Oxfordshire, if I remember right. It's over near there. Um, but he succeeds with that, and so they're like, okay, yeah, we were right. This guy can do this kind of stuff. And so then they make him the Bishop of Winchester. And we got to remember, of course, that in that period, when Wessex is on the ascendancy, Winchester is the seat of royal power. So it's like if he were in London several centuries
Right.
on. Winchester is the place for the king. Um, so yeah, he becomes the Bishop of Winchester, and then very quickly, he's also made the abbot of the Old Minster in Winchester, kind of as like a dual appointment kind of thing. And he expels the canons famously, the 960s, and then does it to the New Minster shortly after that. And then he kind of goes on to, like the steam starts to build behind this movement. And then Dunstan and Oswald are doing similar kinds of things and reforming monasteries throughout the country, the kingdom. And Ethelwald is reforming and founding new monasteries for men and for women. And it really gets going in the 960s, 970s. They're doing a lot of stuff. Um, and maybe I should stop there and see where you want to point us, because
Well, yeah,
now
so I mentioned before we started that words like canon, like what is a canon? Yeah, he
right.
expels the canons. Who are those?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So the canons, no, but, history is always written by the victors, so we got to remember that. Were these canons as bad as Ethelwald and others make out? Perhaps not, right? But the kind of standard story goes. First off, canons are priests who live in community. That's like the most general kind of definition you can give, right? So there's priests who are kind of living off on their own in a prebendary or whatever. Though the parish system hasn't really developed yet, right? So we can't think of like parish priests yet. But there's priests who are out there doing things on their own, and then there's priests who live in communities. So if you look at a monastery and see a bunch of men living together and praying all the time, doing offices, and some of them are going to be priests, so they're doing the mass too. And then you look over here at the canons, and they're getting together to pray all the time, and they're priests, so they're saying mass. Like, is there a real difference here? Like, what's the difference, right? Um, and so this is that part of, the reformers had this idea of Bede's age as being this golden age of monasticism in England. Was it? Yeah, along their terms, maybe not, because the monks back then may have been. This is, some people kind of have shaken this up, some scholars, and say maybe that's kind of what monasticism looked like a lot more in England in the old days, right? Not that there weren't, some very fervent people doing this, um, but it may have looked more like canons. And so they're basically just like not living as strict a lifestyle, right? They're not as bound to certain kinds of discipline by the rule. They won't be fasting as much. In some cases, we don't, like the historicity of this when you're trying to like defame people, it's hard to know, right? Like how seriously we should take this. But certainly some priests back then had wives and families, and that wasn't totally against the rules. It was against some people's rules and the way people wanted the rules to be. But especially the canons, like if you're living in community, then it started to get a little like, well, okay, we've got all this like common property, and now you want to give it to your son, or like it got confused.
Yeah.
So there's just like practical problems too, right? But then also you started having the priesthood becoming a kind of family tradition, right? And so like your son's gonna take over for your prebend or your benefice or whatever from this, this church or that estate and whatever. So like all of that's getting mucked up together, right? And the Gregorian reform about 100 plus years hence is gonna tamp all that down and be like, no, we're just not doing this anymore, right? And this is why the Roman clergy to this day are celibate, right? Like this was a problem, and it hasn't gone
Yeah.
away yet, right? The solution hasn't gone away yet. So that's an interesting, again, kind of side tangent we
Well, I
could go.
remember one of the first beginner texts that a lot of Old English students are started on is maybe a few of Alfred's letters, Alfred of Ancient, of
Yeah.
course. And in his famous preface to Genesis, he clearly has married priests to complain against. He's very upset that they exist, or that people are trying to get married, but he is having to explain the argument that no, you can't have a wife because when all the apostles joined Christ, they gave their wives away. So, we have to do the same thing if we want to be priests. Really fascinating that, I'm used to, of course, the modern Catholic Church, in which, of course, outside of Eastern Catholics, and I think the Byzantine Rite, if I'm not mistaken, priests can't have wives. So to see that Alfred in early medieval England in the 10th century was fighting against that was very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's that's right. We think of them being like us. And in some ways they are, and in some ways they're just absolutely not. Yeah, bishops are like territorial landlords and priests have a bunch of kids. And like that's
Mhm.
just not the world that we we live in the US anyway. So yeah, yeah. But so these canons, they're these people who are living this kind of life, and that's just a no-no, right? Like Alfred was Ethelwald's student at Winchester, right? So he learns
Right.
this from Ethelwald, right? This is a culture for them. That this is just not the way to do this. So, the canons are priests living in community. Some of them might have wives, maybe they don't, but at least like the property stuff is very weird. And they're not living a disciplined life. This is the bottom line for Athelwald. Like they're just living a kind of like dissolute life and then like
Mhm.
pretending to be very holy or something, right? And like but everything else aside, that's problematic. And so in the end, the monks, excuse me, the monks, because they have the discipline, right? They have these vows of obedience, conversion of life and stability. Uh, because they live that kind of life, they are the ones that are worthy to offer God's service in these places, right? And to be trusted
Mhm.
with this kind of the property and the role in society that these kinds of communities are supposed to be having, and that King Edgar is saying they should have, right? I mean, we can't ignore the fact that King Edgar is also instrumental in this movement. We often talk about these bishops, um, Oswald, Dunstan, and Athelwald, as the key figures here, but certainly the king and queen are all about this, or it wouldn't be happening, right?
Right.
And
Makes
part of
sense.
that too is like the land tenure problem, right? If you're gonna start talking about how like, well, these secular guys can't be holding these monastic lands anymore, and you can't, and this is a huge part of like the social and political part of this. They were all about like getting away from people being able to alienate monastic lands, right? Like to give it to somebody else, right? Like, no, we just no, you can't give away monastic lands anymore. Well, who has the authority to tell aldermen and thanes they can't do that? I mean, they
Mhm.
can't. It's like the only authority you can really appeal to for that. And so like that's part of why. And there's this what's called the anti-monastic reaction after King Edgar dies, which is kind of caricatured in some sources, but is real. Because these noblemen are like, you're just taking our land. This isn't okay, and understandably so, right? There's just conflicts of interest going on. Um, so yeah, but anyway, so the canons, back to them. Sorry, the canons, kind of like emblematize kind of like a corrupt and lazy church, right? That's like getting the benefits without putting in the effort or something, right? And so that's
Mhm.
why they must go. Or to be fair, or they can become monks too, right? Some of the Winchester monks seem to have been canons, and they stayed and actually, they got with the program and then leave. So that's part of it too.
And then the rule is again implemented strictly. And perhaps a good piece of evidence for that is Athelwald's translation. So could you speak a bit to that?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, well, and I guess I should point this out too as a kind of prelude to that. The Benedictine monasticism that they are implementing. Well, I kind of referred to it earlier in these early 10th century reforms on the continent. But even those were looking back to Carolingian texts to understand like what is it to be a monk. So they're certainly looking back to the rule itself, but they're also looking back to people like Saint Benedict of Agnan and Smaragdus, who were instrumental in kind of shaping the Carolingian mode of monasticism. And that's when the rule of Saint Benedict becomes the standard rule in the West. Before the reforms in the early ninth century in the Carolingian Empire, um, the rule of St. Benedict's just one rule amidst other rules, right? There's all kinds of other rules going on, and lots of people or lots of communities have very particular idiosyncratic kinds of habits and customs and all that. And nobody thought that that was a problem, right? It wasn't like this was a decay of something. It was just, that's how it is, right? You just use whatever you got have to hand and whatever works best. That's what this community does. But Charlemagne was very much interested in uniformity throughout the empire, right? That's one of the ways that he is able to curry uh, or to solidify power. Say that, right?
Right. Yeah.
Ways to solidify power. Um, and I'm not necessarily saying that's a terrible thing. I mean, I wasn't ruling an empire, so I don't know what it's like. But but he made his choices. Okay, so, um, but so the idea that like Benedict set out to create this huge order, and have it spread throughout the world, like that's just not the case at all, right? He wasn't like Saint Francis saying like, "Hey, I'm gonna form this new order, and then we're gonna go everywhere, man." Just not the case. Benedict was like, Monte Cassino is where I live. I want it to be regularly um, administered, including after I die. And so here's a text that does that. That's it.
Hmm.
Like it's for the place he was living. And it circulated like the other rules did. They kind of just circulate to other places because people say, well, hey, how am I supposed to do this if we're founding a monastery on this duke's land, right? And they say, oh, well, here's a few rules and, that kind of thing, presumably, right? Um, but yeah, under Charlemagne, we just say, nope, not the case, right? Well, actually, I think those things get promulgated formally under Louis the Pious, but, the Carolingian dynasty. So they're the ones who say, this is the rule. St. Benedict's rule is the way that monasteries will be administered throughout the empire. That's it, full stop, right? And so there's a lot of scholarship actually that goes into that. Anyway, when people later on start saying, "Hey, we need to like get this going better again. We need to like reform what we're doing," they're looking back mainly to that era, right, as a way of understanding what we're supposed to really be doing. And then in turn, when Athelwold and Dunstan and Oswald and other people are doing a similar thing in England, they're seeing that going on too. So they adopt the rule of St. Benedict because, well, of course that's the rule, but it's of course because of all the stuff that the Carolingians were doing. Okay.
Right.
So we have a kind of hegemonic rule that like St. Benedict himself never intended, right? So
Mhm.
that's kind of an interesting, weird paradox about this whole movement. That's fascinating to me. Anyway,
Yeah.
so like no end. I don't know why, but it's fascinating. So yeah, but Saint Elewald is tells us in this document called by modern editors King Edgar's Establishment of Monasteries, which seems to have been a prologue of sorts or something to this translation of the rule that he did. He tells us that King Edgar wanted to understand what the heck the rule said.
Hmm.
Presumably he doesn't say this way, but like the implication is he didn't have Latin, right? Like King Edward didn't understand Latin, so he couldn't read the rule. At least like, enough, right, to be able to read it
Should have had a
fluently.
better tutor.
I know, right? Yeah, that's right. Well done. So so the king orders him to translate this. And there's actually some corroboration for this in later documents that were presumably around contemporaneously, but later copies. Anyway, but then he also tells us on his own accord that, there's just a lot of people coming into the monasteries who don't have Latin either, and we need them to understand what the rule says. And so he says, I think the translation is, it's a good project because people need to know, and it doesn't really matter. He says explicitly, which I think is pretty darn pretty darn modern for a guy in the 10th century. He says it doesn't matter what language you use as long as you come to the Lord, right? That's all that matters. So it doesn't matter if you have Latin, we'll just put it in your mother tongue. Like that's a surprising thing for a 10th century ecclesiast to say, I think. It's a pretty cool deal.
Really
Um,
explains the kind of work ethic of his student Alfred, I think.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And the whole Winchester school is really like they are the first people trying to make a kind of standardized Old English, right? They're trying
Mhm.
to say we can do this carefully in our own tongue. Here's how we'll do it. And then William the Bastard comes in and
Oh.
sets things off track, and there's all that, but we won't go there. Um, but they were trying. They were trying. It was a really cool project. Um, but so when Ethelwald translates the rule, he's trying to get, again, at least according to this document, and it seems to line up with other things that are said and done. He's trying to help more people understand what this life is actually about. He wants people to have access to it. So he translates it in probably the 960s. There's some arguments too, but maybe it's a little earlier actually, and he just publishes it when King Edgar wants him to do this. But I don't have a particular dog in that fight myself. But around the middle of the 10th century, Ethelwold does this thing. And I think it's important. I mean, one of the reasons that I wanted to do this and translate, because I mean, the first section in the book is called "A Translation of a Translation."
Yeah.
I know that's a kind of a goofy thing to do, right? Um, but I had heard so many people dismiss this text as like, well, no, we don't need to worry about Ethelwald's translation because it's a translation. Just go read the rule. But translation, if you've read any of the Alfredian texts, the translation doesn't mean the same thing for them as it does,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
Some of them are pretty close, but some of them take massive kinds of license with the text. And they're saying different things. If they use a kind of like Roman example that people aren't familiar with in England, they'll just use an English example instead that's comparable. Um, Adding complete books like in Augustine's soliloquies,
For sure. Yeah.
doing whatever they want.
And I
Um,
think viewers might be interested to know, if I am correct, you're probably referencing the whole situation where Fabricius, the Roman smith, legendary smith, is translated as Wayland. Of course, the legendary Germanic smith in the Boethius translation, which is people like to point to that as a good example of the sort of length that the translator clearly felt comfortable taking
yeah.
in terms of artistic interpretation, you know.
Yep, absolutely. And it's funny that you mentioned that because yes, you're absolutely right. That's what I was referring to. And yesterday, our wonderful poetry bookstore here, Woodland Pattern in Milwaukee, had they have a all weekend poetry festival thing, and I was reading for Marquette yesterday, and I read my translation of that exact passage from the
Oh,
Boethius
wonderful.
for
I think
that.
that might be my favorite poem in the constellation, to be honest. It's
Oh
a great
yeah.
one.
And then I read the Old English too, because who's gonna do that? People are like, what's going on? So that was a lot of fun. So great. Yeah. No, Waylon's, yeah, he's fantastic too. Um, but yeah, so, Ethelwald on the spectrum of this, he's pretty conservative. He's staying pretty close to Benedict's text, but he does change some things. But he more just kind of massages things and clarifies things, you know. So for an example, there's a Carolingian abbot named Smaragdus, believe it or not, and he had done a commentary on the full rule in the ninth century. And Ethelwald is obviously sitting there with it next to him, because he's like, "Oh, okay, this is how you explain that thing in the rule." And so he just writes it into the rule. He doesn't say like, "And Smaragdus says blah blah blah." It's just part of the rule now, right? And so he's conflating these texts not because he's trying to like monkey things around or do some kind of like subversive thing. He's just saying, I want people to understand what's going on here, right? And so if this is going to clarify, just put it in. He doesn't have any scruples about doing that, and he doesn't feel like he needs to name drop or put a note in. He just incorporates it into the text. So that's kind of fun to see. Like this is how a 10th century mind thought about authorial intent and authority and all these kinds of things.
Mhm.
And you're never going to get that if you just go read the Rule of Saint Benedict in an English translation from the Latin text, right? You just.
Right.
So if you don't care about Anglo-Saxon England or early medieval translation strategies, okay, yeah, maybe this isn't for you, right? But I was like, but if you do care about those things, then this is actually a really important text, right? Because this is like a
Mhm.
guy who is at he is at the heart of royal and ecclesiastical power in the 10th century when England is becoming England, right? This is when Edgar is the first person to call himself the King of the English, right? Or no, wait, that's Alaskan. Yeah.
Yes, yes, you're
I think
yes.
that's Alaskan. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Oh, um, but King Edgar is the first one to start being talked about in imperial terms too, right? In different
Mhm.
texts, with his having the entire country united under his crown, but then also these other kinds of peripheral kings coming under him, and so he's a really important figure. For the kind of consolidation, right, of national kinds of sentiment in the kingdom. And Ethelwald's right there with him the whole time. And he gives us a window into who he is in this translation. And it's fascinating. And you gotta like you really have to attend to the details, but he's there, you know. One other thing, like an example, well, I'll give you two other examples quickly. One, he has a kind of Christological bent that he wants to make explicit. There's a few places in the rule where he's not really trying to clarify a particular like knotty point or anything, but he just like mentions kind of in like parentheses sort of. And by the way, like this is the monastic life. It's like it's the path to Christ, right?
Right.
And like yeah, it's not revolutionary or anything like that, but it is interesting that he's trying to like make clear again, because like the other examples that we have, he's obviously trying to help people understand what's really going on. And so when he does this edition, if that's his MO, he's trying to like make sure because like frankly, Benedict doesn't talk about Christ that much, right? I mean, Christ is there, God is there, but he's not going on and on because it's a very practical document, right? And so Ethelwald's pretty clearly a little apprehensive about that to me. Having spent so much time with that text, it's like, no, no, we got to like make sure people know we're doing all this for Christ. It's not like you just do it, right? Like this is a Christian path. Like it matters to say it. There's also a couple things where they're talking about like with the oblature, you know, giving people to the monastery and like what happens with the property that's given, right? There's a thing in the Latin that Ethelwald's obviously like, we don't want any trouble with this. So it's like he translates this thing about the way that property is used after you give somebody to a monastery. He translates it basically as like, and so they'll give them some food for their ride home. And clearly, he wants nothing to do with property problems, right? But and that's a huge
Mhm.
part of what the reform was doing on a social and political level. So there's these little windows into a much bigger world that are going on, and we just don't get that, especially with a
Mhm.
named figure, you know. And so, like when we actually can see into Athelwold of Winchester's mind a little bit, it's just fascinating.
Yeah, that is pretty sick. My last question is your book. Obviously, everyone should buy it and read it. The link is going to be in the description and the pinned comments. But people who really admire late 10th century monasticism, sort of post-reform monasticism in England, that is, of which I know there are many, I honestly myself included. To touch back to the question we brought up earlier, how should people engage with this text that you have put out in order to sort of in their own lives?
Hmm. I mean, to me, uh, well, actually, I mean, I'll maybe take a little sideways um, route in that, in an answer to that, because one thing that I actually kind of feel like I failed on in this book, after it had gone to press, you know, I was younger when I did that. I wasn't as bold when I did this book, and I really would have, you know, kind of going back if I do a second edition, you know, which will never happen, but if I did. I would put stuff in there about how, especially like for thinking about Old English poetry, like the broader literature of this period, which is very deeply spiritual in many ways. I think that this is actually a really good kind of touchstone or foundational text to read in order to understand the poetry. Because a lot of us don't have that like the sensibility of like how we can't feel into their world very well, or even if we want to, we just don't know what to do. And so to me, like this is a text where you can start to see not just the Latin precedents and the late antique stuff that these guys were reading, but also like how he's taking that in and mediating it and understanding it for himself and trying to, again, we can be cynical about Ethelwald's position as a bishop and everything in this world, but he was also trying to shepherd people, right? And he was trying to really lead people and teach people. And he very clearly was doing that too, at least, right? And so to see this as a document where he's really trying to help other people see what Saint Benedict can offer us, I mean, that's a really cool thing. But again, especially like in thinking about how to read The Wanderer and how to read Beowulf and how to read The Dream of the Rood, like this was the same milieu, right? Like this was the same um, cultural imagination, right? So I think it can help kind of scaffold that a little bit, right? Like if you want to really get into that, the spirituality of Anglo-Saxon England, especially in the poetry, I think this is a good kind of like stepping stone to that. We're like filling it out a little bit. Yeah. Um, but yeah, I mean, to me, I'll be idealistic for a second then too, and say, this is one way of engaging with the rule of Saint Benedict that it's a very different kind of way. But the attention to the text that one has to, if you're actually going to see, like, oh, what was Ethelwald really doing? And I have like all the apparatus in there, right? I spent a lot of time going between Receptus and Purus or recensions of the text of Saint Benedict in Latin to understand exactly what Ethelwald was doing, what text he was using, all this stuff, right?
Mhm.
It's all in the notes on the page, so you can see like, oh, this is how Ethelwald's navigating the text and what he adds, what he takes away, what he massages, all that stuff. Um, and so it's on the one hand, you get like in those Christological moments, you see like Ethelwald really trying to push us toward Christ or push us toward love of God, whatever. But also just in the method, he is being so painstakingly careful with the text. And that kind of attention to a text was a spirituality for them, right? Like that was a spiritual mode. I mean, usually with the Bible, the scriptural text, of course, but that was how they were trained to read, right? That like, no, every word matters, and every word has numbers of meanings and different levels of meanings, and you can make this stuff, as long as it, like Gregory the Great said, as long as it goes along with charity, this can mean a lot of different things.
Yeah.
So, his way of engaging with the text is slow and methodical, and really trying to drink it in and meditate on it, chew on it, right? Ruminate on it, as St. Bede tells us early in Anglo-Saxon England, right? To chew the cud and like
Right,
take it
right.
in, spit it back up, see what happens, right? That's what he's doing throughout this whole text. And so he's not only trying to lead you into it, he's also modeling like how you read. And I think that's actually something. Now that I'm saying it out loud, I should write that essay because I didn't think about that before. So thanks for the question. Yeah,
Of course. Dr. Riyeff, thanks for coming on the channel.
absolutely. Thank you.